Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. I'm very excited to be coming to you today with the episode on lettering. I know I've been talking about it for a few weeks and we've kind of put it off, but for the next 30 or so minutes, we hope to talk about the process of lettering, the nuts and bolts, the way to do it, some best practices, some things to look at when you're doing it. And I'm going to bring in with me today my guest, Steve. Steve, tell everybody about yourself and where they might have seen you or where they can find you.
So my name is Steve Cole. I've been editing and teaching comic storytelling to artists, writers, and so on, and editors and even publishers for over 30 years. And I'm also the administrator of the Comic Book Editors Alliance. Right now I'm working freelance editing, so always available for more for more jobs.
Yeah. So people oftentimes they don't understand the importance of an editor. Let's talk about that just for a second, so people understand why it's so important. Why do they need an editor?
Well, editors come in different. They fulfill duties in different capacities. Some are more creator or creative in nature, in the sense that they go through the story right from the start, or starting at the script stage, or go through the dialogue, the copy editing of the text and stuff. Other editors, they go through the the art, making sure that the scripting matches with the artwork, and just doing the full creative package. Some other editors are more project managers and more along the lines of scheduling, hiring, making sure that timetables are maintained, especially in a corporate setting like Marvel and DC. They're mainly the project managers in most cases. In some cases, they do also get involved in the creative aspects.
Yeah. So yeah, I kind of work in that aspect with people as the project manager slash kind of what we call a story editor. I'm definitely not the grammar editor or copy editor. You don't want me doing that. That's not my forte. But so sometimes I think a lot of times what people think of as an editor, they think of someone that does copy edits. They don't realize that they can work with someone that can help kind of the whole overarching thing. And one of the things that is with comics that I found out is that the whole overarching process is often like we think about the beginning of the story, the writing the script. And whenever I talk to a young creator, they're so excited to get pictures on a page that I think they start to skip over some of the things that they really should be focusing on and looking at.
Oh, exactly.
And I think one of the biggest things that people overlook, or one of the things that gets the least amount of attention, is the lettering.
Yes.
I don't know how many times I've with the different companies I've worked for, looking at submissions or reading a book that I've bought off of Kickstarter or supported them, and I look at it and the lettering is just so what's a nice way to put it, Steve?
Not as refined
there you go.
As the art. Yes.
Yeah, that you can tell that it's been it's kind of an afterthought.
Yeah.
Now, for you as an editor, why is it so important that that lettering be done well?
Well, to be honest, lettering is as much as a part of the art as the pencils, as the figure drawing, as the backgrounds, as it all has to come together. It has to be complementary to each other. A lot of people, when they look at a comic, they look at the writing and the art. They don't really consider the lettering, but the lettering has to be just as complementary as the writing and the art are together. And quite often what I've found is that the lettering, like you were saying before, was an afterthought. Some artists, their artwork is not as refined as the lettering, and some lettering is not as refined as the art. It's very rare that you'll get a good combination going together. And that's actually part of the problem I find, is that when you're building a creative team, for example, you want a letterer who's going to complement the art but not overpower it. And
yes,
even things like the font that's used for the art. Jack Kirby with his larger figures and block style figures. If you put tall, thin letters on his artwork, it's going to stand out. It doesn't complement. And likewise, the other way around with tall, lanky characters and wide letters. It's the exact opposite. They don't work together.
Yeah. So we're going to have a few people coming in and, comment. We're going to throw those up there. So if anyone's watching and you do have questions, feel free to ask. And we are going to do a bit of a demonstration today too. We're going to do some font selecting and some making bubbles and how to make the tails and place the tails and how wide the tails should be, when to use different colors for bubbles and all of that kind of stuff, and how to do that in Photoshop. Because I know most people have Photoshop. And so the tutorial aspect will be done on Photoshop. So Josh Shelton says indie lettering getting much better. Thankfully, it is actually getting better. And I think it's because of the efforts of people like Steve, Chuck Pino, who does a lot of my editing. There's a greater standard that's happening. But here's one thing that I've noticed. A lot of people try to cut corners with lettering because it's expensive. The art is expensive. And so they want to try to take on that aspect of lettering themselves. And maybe they don't really know the best practices, or maybe they want to get into lettering and they just don't know the best way to do it. They're using, they've got some program where they type in fonts and they do the bubbles and they do all that kind of stuff. And there's some programs that are now dedicated towards that. And we might feature those in the future on future episodes. But on standard, Steve, when it comes to lettering, like, have you ever lettered a book yourself? Or
I've lettered, but not a published book. Usually what I'll do is quite a few of my clients are lettering their own books. And it actually works sometimes because that way I can communicate with them versus communicating with a letterer trying to work with the art. So there are certain benefits to creators who are trying to do their own lettering, because it's kind of like the creators doing everything. But the letterers who do get hired on, even the professional ones, sometimes they're trying to work with the art and the art isn't exactly allowing them the proper spacing. And I remember this one piece of art where the artist had put two characters opposite each other, but the right-hand character was the first speaker. And so the letterer had to try and create balloons and tails that were crisscrossing, and it completely ruined the look of the panel.
Yeah. Well, I've actually done that myself before. And I was like, oh man, because early on I would do everything myself. I would do the art, the coloring, and the lettering all myself. And so I got kind of good at all of those pieces together because I have a visual eye and I want the lettering. So for me, I believe that the lettering is supposed to complement the book, just like you said. So the writing is very important. And most time you can have like a really well-written book, but if it has a bad art, people are going to reject it because of the art usually. But you can have something that has pretty decent art and it's bad writing, and people will almost accept it just for being what it is because they visually like to look at it. And so we have to understand that comics is a visual storytelling medium. And so when you take the concept of visuals into effect, that means every aspect of it, including the font that you use. And so for me, nothing makes a book look as cheap as someone using a free font. So what are your thoughts on that one?
I find that some free fonts could work, but it's trying to fit a square peg into a round hole sometimes. And, I know that Blambot offers a lot of free fonts, and one of my clients has used a lot of these free fonts when they're appropriate for the material, but in general, I find that the free fonts could work, but it has to match up in some regards. One font does not work for every project, and one font doesn't work for every character. Sometimes the font or the color of the balloon or the shape of the balloon, are what reflects the character.
Yeah. So I did have a question here from Nick Tockard, from Nicholas Anthony Tockard. And he asked, does anyone professionally still letter by hand, or has it all switched to digital font selection?
I believe that Klein still letters by hand every once in a while.
Yeah, I think there are a couple people. It is much more intensive and expensive. So than it is to do digitally, I believe.
Yeah.
Especially if there's any kind of error or mistake. And so,
and that's when you were talking about errors and mistakes. One of my clients in California, she has tried the hand lettering, but it is so hard to make corrections once the lettering is already done.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That means it has to be a well-edited script that's not going to have to go back in and change a lot of things. And can you imagine that's how they did everything back in the day?
Yeah. But, it's not just the script. In advance, the placement of the balloons, just the balloons themselves, should be placed in the artwork so that you at least know where they're going to go.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a trick that a lot of people have kind of lost over the years. So what I want to do is I want to share the screen here. And this is a page from my book, Hybrids, The Sons of Gods, issue number 5. Okay. And there are a few things going on in here. I'll just show, kind of just start out with I'll turn everything back on here so we can all see it.
One of the things I appreciate about this page is that there's a lot of negative space. So you have some room to place the balloons, whereas some busier pages, the lines don't allow as much opportunities for proper space, proper placement.
True. And I actually got I like to draw elaborate backgrounds, but I actually got some criticisms on this page particularly. And I remember you said something about this page or another page that was similar to this. Because not all the time do you need a lot of backgrounds. Okay. So there's a couple things here, and we'll just zoom in on this. My layout artist, I have a layout artist, and he did not leave me. And when I got to drawing, I liked the panel so much that I just drew the face there and did not leave me room for the bubble within the panel. And so this is typically a rule that I do not break. But sometimes I do, because sometimes the art and the layout of things allows you to do that. And so when we start getting into kind of like the basic flow of a page, you want the text to go from, I don't know if can you see my cursor?
Mm-hmm.
If I were to start up here,
yep,
and to either work its way across in a Z form like this, or to go diagonal down the page, start back up there again, and then go diagonal down again, is typically what I was taught by people that had done things professionally. So in your experience, is that the typical, or is there a time when that might be a rule that you might break?
Really it depends on how much text there is. For example, in a rule like this, one of the things I'll tell you, first of all, that when your character is speaking, it depends on if the words come before the facial expression or the action of the body. I can say that I'm going to punch you, but the action has to be on the left and the punching has to be on the right. Okay.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And so let me because that rule was used here. There's this, I've got plenty of space on this side to put that bubble, and I had plenty of space on this side to put that bubble.
Yep.
But I wanted to establish the view of the villain before he spoke. So otherwise it's like, oh, you're going to read what he says or hear what he says, and then you're going to see him. And I wanted to do that the opposite way. I want you to see him clearly and then read what he has to say.
Now, I was going to say that depending on how much text there is in that balloon, you may want to divide it up and have part on one side, part on the other side.
True. Yeah. Or do a part here at the front and then create a second.
Yeah.
And create pause. And the reason why you would do that with lettering, why you would break up that text, is because now you're trying to put in natural pause. Whenever I write a script or whenever I'm lettering a book, I try to think in terms of how it would be said in like a movie or a TV show or something, if it was in real life, like how it would come out. So if I were to say something like he says here, don't feel bad. He says, don't feel bad, Reverend. You're just not strong enough to beat me. So close this time too. like I almost put that so close this time too into another one because I almost wanted it to be kind of like a pause, in that dialogue.
I would actually suggest it into a connected balloon without
Yeah.
a connecting tail.
Yeah, but I was kind of thinking, how would he say it? Like, what would be the diction? How would he pace that? And for him, it was like so, like he's kind of just so quick and cocky with it. I was like, he would say that all together in that sense. But in some cases, it's you're breaking it up to break up the ideas. It's not just to fit the part of it's to fit the text into a bubble or into a panel better. But a lot of it is it's more than that. It's to really pace what's being said.
Yeah. And one of the things that I suggest, and I know a lot of people who do not do this, is you read it out loud. Because you don't read it out loud if you only imagine it, then you're not getting the full effect. It's like saying that I'm angry versus just feeling anger. Once it's out there, you can see it almost. It's almost like it's realized. So I always suggest role playing, and part of that role playing is reading the dialogue out loud. And reading that dialogue out loud also allows you to find the nuances where certain words would be bolded, if there would be more of a pause, for example, like an ellipsis or a double dash, or even with if you were, like I was suggesting with the so close this time too, it's a matter of, is it in the same balloon? Is it in a connected balloon? Is it in a connected balloon with a tail connecting them so that they're further apart?
Yeah. And then if someone interrupts speech, and that's where this comes down here, when we come down to this part, that's why I was able to break the rule of not having the bubble inside of the panel, because the panel needed to focus on her expression, but he says something, and then her dialogue is what changes the scene. So it was kind of one of those in my head, if you're hearing, like you're seeing him say something, and then you start to hear the character say something and the camera pans to them. And so that was kind of the effect that I was trying to get with the lettering. And so you can actually use the lettering to make the reader read it the way you want them to read it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the idea is when you're, like you just said, you want the reader to read it the way that you intend. Quite often, I noticed that you have like, hey, big guy is bolded. Okay.
Yeah.
If you do not put the nuances in yourself, the bolds and italics or the larger letters and such, then your reader is reading it the way that they hear it.
Yeah.
And will capture the nuances that they are interpreting from it, not what you intend. And so it's like I said, myself, I always suggest that people read it out loud so that they can establish what those nuances are going to be, to make sure that the reader understands those nuances as well.
Yeah. And oftentimes I will use the bold. And even if I don't letter and I have someone else do the lettering, I'm like, I will put in my script, like the letters, the things that I want bold, because I've thought about it. And when she says, hey, big guy, because that's, she's talking to this character Trash Man that's going to, kind of disrupt this whole situation in the next page. And so, now when it comes to tails and when it comes to balloons, so I've kind of got a couple of things here, and I did a couple of things specifically different on this page to, I broke one of my rules, but I did it intentionally. And so typically what I'll do is I do like to use a particular font. And the font I like to use is one called Evil Genius. And it's one of my favorite fonts. It is a font that costs money, but there's a few of them that I use, but that's probably the one that I tend to go to probably more frequently than others. And the font doesn't matter so much. It's kind of the look and the feel of the font. I feel like it's a pretty universal font for the characters that I draw. So the books that I do, it really works really good with my stuff. But when I'm lettering somebody else's book, I don't always use that font. Again, I'll choose fonts that really work well for them. And then I don't always use the same font in the book that I'm doing for each character. Now I did in this particular issue, the same font is used throughout. So I didn't change that at all because I wanted some consistency there. But what I did is I started changing the balloons. And so I did the balloons a little differently. And so I did this. Typically I'll make the tail. This is one of the first balloons that I ever did where it's just like kind of all rigid like that. Because I started thinking about his voice. And obviously when he's in his human form, he's got a different voice. But when he's talking, when he's here, it needs to have that something that one of my favorite books to read is Swamp Thing. And they do a great job of giving different different balloon shapes, colors, and getting the idea that there's a different voice coming out of that character. And so I wanted to give this character a voice. And so what I did is I did this real kind of like jagged, kind of rough thing to kind of give this idea that he's got this like deep, almost rough sounding kind of voice. And typically my tails, I don't make any bigger than either the width or the height of the font that I'm using. But because he's got, I wanted it to be like this deep booming voice, I made it slightly bigger so that it kind of comes out like, so it kind of looks like it's coming out with more force. And so, again, using the lettering as a form of art to tell the story. So it's like, oh, kind of coming out that way. And then down here, I did a little thinner, just a little thinner of the tail to kind of contrast that. It's just like in the moment it looked right. And then here without, it's more of the type of tails I use changed for the dialogue and all that kind of stuff too. So it's like, it's one of those things where I'll make the choices not haphazardly, but like her statement, "Hey, big guy, aren't you going to get the door for me?" It's really sharp and pointed and kind of in that moment. So I used a nice sharp pointed tail to do that. And so you could actually use the different types of tails and different types of methods to tell the story. And so so that was kind of some of those things. So what do you when it comes to things like that, what's some of the things that you look for or you suggest when you're editing a book?
Well, one of the first things is you were talking about how it's a little wider. The tail connecting to the balloon is a little wider for the evil character there. Try and always keep it consistent. There's 3 letterers who have web pages where they talk about the education or they teach about